In this lab, we will go ahead and create a virtual network in Azure subscription. In the virtual network, we will create two subnets. And thereafter, in each subnet, we will be hosting two virtual machines. The communication between each of the virtual machines will then be established with security groups. Let's get started. I am currently logged into my subscription and I'm using a pay-as-you-go subscription, but if you are doing the labs along with me, you may have to create a free tier account for yourself. To create a virtual network, I will click on Virtual Networks right here, and then this will navigate to me a section where I can create virtual networks. I can either click on the Add button or Create Virtual Network. And this will take me to a blade where I have to fill up the options like the name of the virtual network, address space, subscription, etc. I'll quickly fill these up. The name of the production as vnet_production. I can use a class C or class B or class A address space. Make sure that you research on what is RFC 1918. Basically, it states that IP addresses are classified as class A, B, C, D, and E, and it also talks about private addresses and public addresses. I will use a class C address /16, which will give me about 65,000 IP addresses, which is a very big range. You can choose a subscription as pay as you go, or if you're using a free subscription, you will see free trial in this drop-down menu. Make sure you have a resource group. I will create a new resource group as I do not have it. Say payroll and say okay. Select a region and then a subnet name as well. Just call it as subnet 1. And the address space must be within this address space and not outside it. So I'll select 192.168.30.0/24. I'll leave the rest of the default settings and click on Create. It will take a minute to fully create a virtual network in Azure. Now that my virtual network vnet_production is ready, I'll click on it and then create another subnet. When we were creating the virtual network, we created a single subnet. But then to create another subnet, you have to click on the subnet section and then click on the plus subnet button. As you notice, there is a subnet 1, which is already available because this was created during the vnet creation. I will click on this button to create a second subnet. I'll call this as subnet 2. And the CIDR block will be 192.168.40.0/24. I'll leave the rest of the options default and click on OK. It will take a minute to create the second subnet in the existing virtual network. Now that the subnet is created, we are now ready to host virtual machines in each of the subnets. So when we are creating virtual machines, we must make sure that we are pointing it to the following vnet_production virtual network, and then in each of the subnets we will be hosting virtual machine each. Let's go ahead and create virtual machines. To create a virtual machine, I need to click on this virtual machine option on the left hand side and then click on this add button. This will give me a blade or a form that will let me fill up the options like the virtual machine name, the resource group, etc. Let's start by selecting the resource group. We already have a resource group with the name payroll, so I'll select that. The virtual machine name, let's call it as web server 1. And then we'll select the region. So I need to select the same region where I have the virtual network, which is the central US. At this time, I do not need any redundancy. I'll leave the image as Windows Server 2012 Data Center. Okay, 2 CPUs and 8 gigs is actually a lot for our test environment. So let's go ahead and change the size. I'll change the size to not the lowest available because I'm looking at performance as well. I think 2 CPUs and 4 GB of RAM is good for now. I'll select the username as admin and make sure that I will give it a strong password. So looks like my characters are accepted. Inbound ports, I need to have 3389 allowed because this is a Windows based machine. I need to do RDP to this machine, so I will have port number 3389 or RDP selected. If I would have selected Linux machine here in the drop down menu, then I had to select SSH because Windows does not listen on 22 and Linux doesn't listen on 3389, right? So you need to select appropriate ports. Yeah, I do not have a Windows license, so I'll select no. Choose the hard disks carefully here because by default it points to premium SSD, which is of course going to give you a lot of performance, but then also is expensive. So I will choose a standard hard disk in this case because I'm not looking for great performance, but anything that lets me do this lab is fair enough, and standard HDD is good for that. I'll select next to select the networking options. Remember, we created a virtual network a few minutes ago. So I will select vnet underscore production because this is the only network available in our region. We created two subnets. So we have subnet 1 and subnet 2 in the drop-down menu. This is web server 1 and hence I will select subnet 1. When we create web server 2, I will be selecting subnet 2 in the drop-down menu. I will leave these options as default because that's what I want. I wanted to have a public IP address so that I can RDP from my network. I also want inbound ports to be RDP so that it will allow incoming connections on 3389. I'm not doing a load balancer lab at this time, so I'll select no. Under the management section, I will leave these options as default and click on advanced. Well, these options are also something that I do not want at this time. So next, and then create. It will review the settings, look at all the settings one after another, and then make sure that it validates and checks to see if these settings and parameters are right. And if everything is correct, it will say validation has passed. I'll click on create. My virtual machine deployment is underway, it's in progress, and it will take like 4 to 7 minutes to create Windows-based virtual machines. For Linux machines, it is very quick and not more than 2 minutes for a regular Ubuntu or a CentOS virtual machine. So once the VM is created, we will RDP to it, connect to it, and then we'll progress with creating a second virtual machine. Okay, looks like our virtual machine deployment is complete. I'll click on Go to Resource to go to the virtual machine and then capture its public IP. On the right hand side, I'll see the public IP address of the virtual machine. I'll copy this and then go to the MSTSC or Microsoft Terminal Services console. There, I can copy and paste the public IP address and then click on Connect. This should prompt me to type the user ID and password. Should not take more than a minute to get connected and show us the desktop. So our Windows Server 2012 R2 machine is ready. Let's go ahead and create another virtual machine, Web Server 2, in the second subnet, which is subnet 2 in the same vnet, which is vnet-production. To do so, I'll minimize this RDP and go to the virtual machines, and I will follow the same exact procedure to create a second web server. The resource group will be same. The name of the virtual machine will be Web Server 2. Make sure we select the same region and select a Windows machine here. Change the size to something acceptable, which is 2 CPUs and 4 gigs of memory. Type the username and confirm the password. And I'll make sure that I'm allowing RDP here. I'll leave rest of the options as default. And let's click on next. I have to wait in the networking section to make sure that the virtual network selected is right and the subnet selected is subnet 2. I'll just click on next, leave these options as default and quickly create the second web server 2. We'll again run through the validation. Once the validation is complete, click on create. I'll now pause the video and start again once the virtual machine deployment is completed. The virtual machine is now created. I'll click on Go to Resource to go to the virtual machine. And just like what we did previous time, I'll launch the MSTSC, which is also called as Microsoft Terminal Services Console, or the remote desktop connection. I'll copy its IP address and paste it here so that will take me to this new web server that we just created. Should be quick to connect to the second virtual machine because we have given enough CPUs and memories to it, and there's no application running on it, so there's no overhead on the virtual machine, so performance must be good. So now what we have is a set of two virtual machines running on two different subnets in the same vnet. The objective is to connect these two virtual machines and make sure that they are reachable. The first thing that we have to do is open the firewalls on the virtual machines, so at least we can have some kind of connectivity there. Right now, these two virtual machines are totally isolated. Now that both the virtual machines are created and we were also able to RDP to this virtual machines, I will go ahead and keep them side by side so that we can test and verify the connectivity. So this on the left hand side is my web server 1 and this is web server 2. Just type hostname to verify. Yeah, this is web server 1 and this is web server 2. I can just type ipconfig on each of these machines to identify their IP addresses. So if you notice, their IP addresses are in this range, which is 192.168.30. This was the CIDR block of the subnet 1 and hence it got an IP address in that range. If you look at the second virtual machine, you will see the IP address in the range of what's assigned to subnet 2, which is 192.168.40.0.4. Let's see if we can ping these two virtual machines. Say ping 192.168.webserver2's IP address, which is 192.168.40.4. Yes, we are able to ping it. Let's also try to do it from the second machine, which is 192.168.30.4 from here. .30.4. Enter. So that means that the communication is well established between these two virtual machines. Let's see how this is happening. Now I'm going to go back to the Azure console and look at the networking section. In the networking section, although we have explicitly opened only 3389 from anywhere, look at the second rule, which says allow vnet inbound on any port, on any protocol from any virtual network. So communication between the virtual machines is already there. It's there by default. Okay. So you can click on this particular network security group and see what the default options are. I'm going to click on inbound security rules. And the first one, as we know, is the one that we created, but the rest of them are default. If you click on this little icon here which says default rules, it will not show you the default rules. So this one is explicitly created. But if I click on this default rule option, it will show me what the default rules are. That means by default, the virtual machines will be able to talk to each other just because of this rule. At times, even after having this particular rule in place, the virtual machines may not be able to talk to each other because Windows has an inbuilt firewall. So you may have to allow a rule on the inbuilt Windows firewall, or specifically for ping connections, you have to allow ICMP. In this lab, we created a virtual network with two subnets, and then we created two virtual machines in each subnet. We also saw how the communication happens between the two web servers, or we can say any resources. So even if we would have created a database in the second subnet, the communication will happen based on the rules in the security group. Security group act just like the firewall on your premise, so you can allow inbound connections or outbound connections in the security groups.